We're going to get started here. I'm going to take the leap of faith that everyone can see and hear me out there in the audience. I want to welcome everyone. I want to welcome back many of you who've been here for the previous sessions, and also for the first timers who are joining for the finale. This has been a three-part online, discontinuous in time global conference on the US-China rivalry and Biden Doctrine in the Asia Pacific, hosted by Yonsei University's Center on Oceania Studies, with generous support from the Asia Research Fund. If you've been here, you'll know it's been a rich feast of insight and argument so far. And it's sort of interesting, the gaps in time between the sessions allows us to reflect on the previous panel as we look forward to the next one. And I wanted to highlight a couple themes that have come out for me, and in particular, two, I will call them preliminary points of convergence that are emerging from the conference, despite many areas where we're having a very good, robust debate. So the first one for me is that no one so far disputes the premise that the US and China are entering or have entered an era of rivalry. Peking University's Wang Dong described Beijing as a reluctant rival, forced for now to engage in competition sought by Washington. While in that first session, Princeton's John Eikenberry offered almost the mirror opposite analysis, arguing that on top of the structural features of power transition, when a dominant power feels challenged by a rising one, Eikenberry's stress, I think, was on the aggressive posture, rhetoric, and actions of China under Xi Jinping that has left the Trump and Biden administrations no choice but to shift to strategic competition. So the net effect, this is my interpretation, of Professors Wang Dong and John Eikenberry, is that they essentially agreed the rivalry is on. Now, the second point for me is that no one sounds very happy about this. Stein Tønnesen of PRIO, Peace Research Institute in Oslo, made maybe the strongest argument that no one in the world wants US-China rivalry. And he offered a list of areas where US-China cooperation is essential, starting with climate change. Last night's panelists, last night here in Korea, in Asia, similarly cast the rivalry in, I would say, mostly negative terms. My Yonsei colleague, Lee Hee-jin, for example, suggested that rivalry in technology, and in particular technological standards, threatens to end an era of connectivity, even creating something that I just learned scholars are calling a splinter net. Meanwhile, Maria Repnikova at Georgia State shared her research, which I found fascinating, on the US-China rivalry in soft power. Building on her fieldwork in Africa, she drew a contrast in the ideational approach of the United States, focusing on identity and ideals, versus the pragmatic approach of the PRC, which focuses on material economic interests of the target. While the Atlantic Council's Myun Oh identified a parallel sort of contrast in terms of trade and economic relationships, looking at Southeast Asia. So I'd say none of these developments related to US-China rivalry were cast as positives. Even Ryan Haas of Brookings, who did argue that we might see a virtuous cycle emerge where the US and China compete in ways that make themselves and the world a better place, even Haas noted all the dangers inherent in rivalry and implied that the key really is to rein it in by getting both sides to focus on getting their own house in order. Haas and others suggested that there were constraints on the rivalry given the ambivalence toward it in the region of the Asia Pacific and the wider world. So far, none of our panelists sees the world dividing into two blocks. The overall ambivalence or even negativity toward rivalry is striking to me, since, at least watching it from afar, I sometimes get the sense in Washington there is a measure of excitement over the new era of competition, as if this second Cold War is going to be as entertaining and victorious as the first one is remembered to have been. Now, those are only preliminary summaries, and they're my own sense of the discussion. They also leave out the full richness of the debate that we've heard so far. In this, our final session, we get a chance to really drill down on the question of how US-China rivalry is seen from across three regions that are geographically, economically, and politically positioned in between the United States and China: Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, and Oceania. And we are fortunate to have four tremendous Sherpas to guide us, two of whom are old friends of mine and two are newer friends. So let me introduce them and we'll get the panel going. Sheila Smith is the John Moreau Senior Fellow for Asia Pacific Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. She is, simply put, one of the most astute analysts of Japanese politics and foreign policy that you're going to find anywhere. She is the author, most recently, of Japan Rearmed: The Politics of Military Power, which was published by Harvard University Press in 2019. And I expect to get an Oceania bump on Amazon after our panel concludes, if you don't have it already. We have also with us Kim Joon-hyung, who is Professor of International Studies at Handong Global University, having completed recently his term in the esteemed role as Chancellor of the Korean National Diplomatic Academy. His career spans academic, think tank, and policy advisory positions. And whenever I miss seeing Jun, I just turn on the TV and he's usually there on a current affairs talk show explaining Korea's foreign policy dilemmas and how to handle them. So we're very lucky to have him with us today. Iati Iati is Senior Lecturer in the Politics and International Relations Program and Pacific Security Fellow in the Center for Strategic Studies at Victoria University of Wellington. He is the author of a growing body of work on foreign policy of the Pacific Island states. And most recently, he contributed a chapter on China's impact on New Zealand foreign policy in a superb volume called The China Alternative, which I also commend to you. We are thrilled to have his voice speaking from Oceania. And last but not least, Huong Le Thu is Senior Analyst at the Australian Strategic Policy Institute, often known as ASPI, and non-resident Senior Fellow at CSIS. She boasts an impressive career in academia and think tanks, with stretches based in Singapore, Taiwan, Australia, in addition to bringing deep knowledge of Vietnam and Vietnamese foreign policy. So we have really an amazing group. We're going to start with a round of 10-minute presentations from each of them and then head into discussion. You are strongly encouraged to pose your questions in the Q&A, and I will do my best as moderator to get them answered or at least addressed and brought into the mix. We have some journalists out there, so I want to remind the speakers that this is a public, on record for attribution event. And I would ask the media, members of the media, as a courtesy to credit the Yonsei University Rivalry Conference for any content that might be useful from our proceedings. So with that, Sheila, I want to turn the keys to the Zoom over to you.
Thank you, John, and thank you for that very generous description of my expertise. I'm delighted to be here. I'm delighted largely because we have such a great body of representatives of the region, and so this is an exciting conversation for me. I have been tasked not to talk about Washington, but rather to talk about Japan. So let me just give you in a nutshell what I think is really important for your listeners to understand. There's 3 points, and I'll get a little detailed on each of them, but just for now, as a start off, I think it's important to remember that outside of the US PRC strategic rivalry, Japan has had its own experience of late, with a rising China and with new strategic tensions with the PRC. And that, of course, those of you in the region know this well, but it's always useful to remember that it's not always a function of the US China relationship. The second point I think is really important, and I think we tend to get our scope a little narrowed when we talk about Tokyo's questioning of the reliability of the United States, both as a leader in the region, but also as a strategic partner of Japan. And I think it's not just about the last 4 years of the Trump presidency, it's a larger structural challenge for Japan to manage. And I'll talk a little bit about that. And then finally, I think there's some hard choices ahead. And this is really, John, where I think the strategic rivalry, the acceleration of the strategic rivalry between the United States is going to force Tokyo into some trade-offs that up until now, it really hasn't had to make. And so I think that's my third point here. So let's start a little bit with Japan's China tensions. We all know that the territorial dispute of the uninhabited islands in the East China Sea erupted in 2010 with a fishing trawler captain. Then they grew into government to government tensions by 2012. And then finally, Xi Jinping and then Prime Minister Abe met in Beijing to say, okay, we are worried about the risk of an accelerated dispute. And we're certainly worried about the military risk, miscalculation, right, in the East China Sea. So let's work a little bit on maritime risk reduction, and let's get back to our bilateral conversation that had been paused during this period of strife. The territorial dispute hasn't gone away. The military tensions also really haven't gone away. And luckily, we haven't had an incident where the escalatory dynamic has come into play, but it sits there underneath the relationship. And I think it's important to remember that. The second piece of Japan's difficulties with China, of course, is China has more partners now in its economic relationship. It used to be that the China's dependency on Japan for aid, for foreign direct investment was large. And that was something that tempered the political disputes between the two powers. Today, that economic dependence is also felt deeply by the Japanese, and the Japanese economy is also nervous about the China-Japan relationship. 20% of Japan's overall trade is with China. And you can contrast that with Japan's trade with the United States, which is now about 15%. So you're seeing the shift in the balance between Japan's economic interdependence with China and that of its interdependence with us. There are various estimates, and it's hard, and I'm not the economist, but let me just put this out there, that the various private research organizations in Japan see that there's up to 5 to 8% of Japan's annual GDP growth is related to its trading and investment relationship with China. So any dissonance in that relationship, any kind of introduction of economic coercion by China, for example, would have a significant impact on the Japanese economy. So these things are already in play before we get to the US relationship with China. Japan too has to worry, and this is my second point, it really has to worry about where the United States is going to come down in terms of Japanese security. This is something, especially on the Korean Peninsula, that you have watched and thought long and hard about the United States reliability, and you have formulas for the US ROK alliance that the Japanese alliance with the United States has not had. True, you have presence on the ground or in the waters in and around. You've got 50,000 US personnel in Japan, really there to allow the United States to project force farther from the Japanese islands, but also to deter aggression against Japan. The structural piece of this, though, is really important, and we often forget it, and that is that Japan relies on the United States strategic protection. In other words, Japan remains a non-nuclear power. It relies on the United States for the nuclear umbrella, and any kind of conflict between the United States and the PRC, any kind of military conflict, for example, between Japan and the PRC, would bring that into play for the very first time. We have not in the post-war period ever had a moment where that has been tested. Certainly not either in arms control negotiations or in the rise of tensions, military tensions. And finally, on the reliability side, it's important to note that the self-defense forces now plays a much, much larger role in the US Indo-Pacific Command's strategy in the region. You see the self-defense forces now providing asset protection for carrier task forces in the region. You see the SDF independently of the United States, but in concert with the United States as well, operating with other major maritime powers in the region, establishing sort of sea lanes protection, or at least the demonstration of the capacity for sea lanes protection. But Japan is also branching out a little bit and developing new relationships with European partners, as well as with others inside in the Indo-Pacific. The question here, and the reliability one that comes down to it, is not just a crisis response question about the US reliability for Tokyo. It's really a question on how much and how willing the United States is going to be to continue to use its hard power on behalf of the region, not just on behalf of the United States, but on behalf of its allies and other partners in the region. And this is an important moment of inflection point, I think, for the United States. And Tokyo is watching carefully. So the last piece, and this is the piece where I'll sum up here, where I think to directly address your question about the strategic rivalry, and that is, what kind of choices will this put on the leadership in Tokyo? And I think you've got several. The first, of course, is how much really is Japan willing to increase its military capability, both to work in concert with the United States. And of course, Washington's expectations are always high, that more is better from the Japanese. But you're starting to see this in the 2021 elections, the LDP election. Certainly you saw a very strong voice in the leadership race of the Conservative Party for upping Japan's defense spending. In fact, in the campaign platform for the upcoming lower house, the LDP still has that in there, and that says that 2% of Japan's GDP should be dedicated to defense spending. That's double the share, right, of what Japan currently spends. So you're starting to see at least the advocacy of a much more robust military position by the Japan in the mix in Japan. The second is whether or not the command structure between the Japanese military and the US military is going to be integrated. And this is important as we think about the actual use of force, not just the demonstration of the two militaries' exercises or planning, but actually the kind of integration of capabilities, again, you see in the US-ROK relationship, where there is a war fighting strategy, there are contingency plans, and there is an agreed framework for the use of force, the combined use of force. And that does not exist. But if we get closer and closer to a strategic rivalry that suggests a military use of force scenario with China, then of course that's going to be very, very important for military commanders to understand. The economic side, I hate the word decoupling, so just let me put that out there, because none of us, no matter which economy we're talking about, can actually decouple from China, right? I mean, not without severe economic dislocations in our own national economies, let alone in the global economy. But I think what you're starting to hear from Japan, and the Kishida cabinet has articulated now a new minister in charge of economic security. You're starting to see the Japanese government think in terms of steps that it needs to take independently and alongside the United States, Australia, and India that will strengthen its position vis-a-vis China in terms of its economic security. And that includes things like considering sanctions, should Japanese interests be curtailed, also considering supply chain resilience and other kinds of trade resilience, other kinds of measures that would ensure trade, right, diversification and resilience. And then finally, combined investment in technological innovation. Again, this looks like the Quad agenda. I don't know how much in your previous sessions you've talked about the Quad, but Japan is very interested in making sure that this economic security dimension becomes part of what it does, not only by itself, but it does alongside the United States and other partners. And then finally, of course, the immediate hard decision may very well be Taiwan. And I would put this separate from my command, military command, the what if questions, but certainly in the 2+2 meeting that the US and Japanese leaders held earlier this year, this question of what do the two militaries, the Japanese and American militaries, need to do to deter aggression against Taiwan. So there will be a very specific conversation on a Taiwan scenario. And again, this is not something that Tokyo has been very willing to really put on the agenda, so to speak, of military cooperation between the two allies. This is something that they have been very, very careful to separate out in alliance conversations about whether or not Japan would assume a military role should there be a cross-straits tension that would involve American deployment of military forces on Taiwan's behalf. So these will provoke obviously a reaction from China, but it'll also provoke some pretty significant divisions within Japan, I think, as you start to see the alliance move in this direction. So I think there's hard choices ahead. Tokyo looks to the United States to be a reliable strategic partner, but also a careful one. And I think there's some worry on both sides of that fence, both the reliability side and the caution side. And of course, Chinese behavior has become much, much more alarming. And you see that in the statements by obviously Japanese political leaders, but you also see it in opinion polling of the Japanese public. China is very worrisome to the Japanese today. Thank you, John.
Great. Thank you so much, Sheila. With sparkling clarity, you've laid out a lot for us to come back to and to relate to the other presentations. So that's a perfect start to the panel. Let's go next to our second voice from Northeast Asia, to Professor Kim. The Zoom is yours. And I think you're muted.
Yes.
There we go.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for having me here. And nice to see new faces, familiar face. And always good to see John online or offline. Okay. And before I start, I have to give apology because I have to leave at around 10 o'clock because the schedule somehow is messed up in the communications. So I have 2 classes overlap with this webinar anyways. Okay, because the wonderful summary by John about what's going on between US and China. So I'll skip that part, how I see these issues. And I'm just directly go to my opinion and Korean perspective. The number of US allies and partners, which is these days, Biden administration's emphasized, combined is more than 60 countries. And the number of countries having China as #1 trade partner exceeds 110. The problem is that most of these countries overlap. Of course, ROK faces the biggest burden as the country's economy heavily depends on China. Our trade volume with China exceed US, Japan, EU combined. Well, it depends greatly on the US in terms of security. The fiercest problem is we are still divided. And, it's very ironic, sometimes surreal to me, these days, China is so close to us, especially economically and, people connections, but still, whenever we talk about the security issues, this block, US, Japan, Korea versus China, Russia, and North Korea. This is almost surreal all the time. And in addition, East Asia is geopolitically more grim as a fourth line, I call it, of US-China competition has been created along the Korean Peninsula, the East China Sea, the Taiwan Strait, and the South China Sea. We can draw a line, and this is the one forefront of strategic competition. And of course, it's these 2 countries are always ready to use this as a leverage against each other. But that means a lot of stress on us. And I don't think it can end in the near future, at least 20, 30 years. So we have to suffer that. Against this backdrop, the ROC US Summit in Washington from May 19th to 22nd drew attention as a measuring stick that can diagnose the current status and prospects of the alliance. The summit was an opportunity to renormalize the Trump administration's alliance policy that caused instability. It appeared that the 2 sides were very clear on what they wanted to exchange. To a large extent, the DPRK issue was common interest, and it was narrowed down to the vaccine cooperation that Seoul wanted from Washington, the technology cooperation such as semiconductors and batteries that Washington expected from Seoul. After the summit, the prevailing view in Korea and the US is that they have been successful, regardless of conservative and progressive, which is very rare these days. The cooperation issues expanded beyond the DPRK to areas such as economy, technology, space, health, human rights, and even democracy. Acquiring the status of global partner could be a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the US recognized ROK as a true strategic partner, but it could demand more responsibility for the US global strategy and increase the risk of being drawn to containment network against China. If the former reflects agreements between the two countries to build practical cooperative relationship in a wide range of areas, the latter reflects China's highly sensitive areas such as Taiwan Strait, the South China Sea, and Quad. There is also a possibility that the resistance to being interrupted into strategic flexibility to Korean government has endeavored since the Nomuyan administration could be jeopardized. The content and wording of joint declaration was significantly toned down by Seoul's effort. Quad, for example, has only been mentioned as one of the open, transparent, and inclusive multilateral systems that ROK can cooperate, but not joining the Quad as a member. Vaccine cooperation is also an achievement in which it is combination of US technology and ROK's biomedicine production capacity. Although Korea's progressives and conservatives might have aligned opinions on the matter, that they took much different tone. Progressive criticized the government for embracing America's containing and excluding China. Conservatives, on the other, acted as if Korea's participation in the American-led anti-China coalition is a fait accompli and welcomed it. Some conservatives even argued that Korea has finally decided to join the American network, like Quad. But both camps have arrived at a hasty conclusion, in my opinion. The victim complex among some Korean progressives and the blind belief in the ROK-US alliance prevalent among Korean conservatives appear both wrong. The joint statement touched upon Taiwan Strait and Quad, but there was no direct mention of China nor Xinjiang. The two leaders acknowledged the importance of open, transparent, and inclusive regional multilateralism, but this does not imply Korea's participation in the groupings. Shaping up anti-China blockadation is a bad idea. Even if US-China relations remain perilous on geopolitical, geoeconomic, and technological and ideological spheres, it should not be described as a new Cold War yet. Since China remains interdependent with the outside world and participates in numerous international institutions, some say that the ROK should revisit how Joseon, the last dynasty of Korea, responded to historical transition between the Ming and Qing dynasty of China. Responded to the historical transition, this advice is flawed in many ways. The US cannot be like a Ming, and it will be difficult for China nowadays to be like Qing. But one clear lesson to take from Joseon's experience is that putting everything in one basket comes with terrible cost. Our alliance with the US is vital to securing our future as China's rise might pose us threat. However, we should firmly respond to any action by the US that could drag us into a new Cold War. The growing competition between the US and China become an irreversible trend as the result of the changing balance of power. Due to crisis of post-war liberal international order, G0 rather than G2, G7, or G20 has been prevalent. The liberal international order has largely been propped up by the US global leadership through multilateral institutions, but this is said to have been a retreat even prior to outbreak of the pandemic. The ongoing crisis of the pandemic has exposed this trend more vividly, as the expanding strategic rivalry seems to place under question the future of global governance. Currently, our government position is clear. The ROK keeps its foreign policy underpinned by the ROC-US alliance, while refraining from damaging its relations with China. This is different from strategic ambiguity, and it is not about seeking a pure balance either. If the two Koreas choose a path that leads to confrontation amid the US-China competition, that the Korean Peninsula could become the center of the clash of these two superpowers. To avoid this, it is necessary to establish its peaceful coexistence. The ROK also needs to work together with countries that have in similar stance to prevent the revival of geopolitics and restore the liberal international order. Instead of being forced to choose between US and China, it can establish so-called, I call it, third zone, in solidarity with countries that share not only troubles that they suffer, but also vision that they want to break through. Pivotal, or I will call it runner-up countries. So middle power is not enough. It's the key word, middle power, or category, the word middle power is not enough, such as ROK, France, Germany, Canada, and Australia, so on, can work together to buffer the US-China conflict and avoid making a binary choice, while assisting developing countries that are suffering from the lack of global governance. The times of US benign leadership in the liberal international order is questionable these days, given America's domestic crisis. China has been pretending to support liberal international order for its survival. Sometimes it's fake. The EU is still committed to it and has voiced for more active role. It is unable to put its money where its mouth is, though. Although a multilateralism for assuaging potential conflict in East Asia long been considered the right path, multilateralism is waning in the region. Nevertheless, being unable to rely on leadership of any single power, collective leadership based on multilateralism will have to be reinvigorated, especially by concerted effort by above-mentioned capable country. Finally, I want to end my presentation with this. Many people says that ask Progress, what is your plan A? Of course, for Progress, plan A is America, but plan B is not China. Plan B is collective leadership. Thank you very much. Thanks for listening.
Great. Thank you so much, Joon. And I should say to everyone involved, when Professor Kim has to leave a little after the hour, that is entirely my fault. Communication and also his commitment as a teacher to get to his students. So we will, if anyone has a question specifically for Professor Kim, please put that in the Q&A. All your questions can go in there, but we'll make sure to get questions to him first after the presentations. So we'll turn next, Iati Iati, to you.
Okay, great. Thank you. Can I share my screen? Is that all right?
Yes, give me 1 second and we'll get that. Okay, try again there.
Have you got my first slide up, China-United States rivalry?
Oh, are you able to share it yourself? I'm not sure we have it on deck. We can try.
Share. All right, this might work.
Oh, super. Yeah.
Excellent.
Sorry about that.
All right, great. Firstly, thank you, John, for the opportunity to participate. I'd like to start with an apology, and that is I've just finished a really heavy lecturing semester, so I'm still in that lecturing mode where I lecture off my slides, hence why you've got the PowerPoint in front of you. The paper I sent through was really written in haste, so this presentation kind of gives more structure to what I'd sent through earlier. And my presentation is on China-United States rivalry, and I put that in quotation marks because that rivalry bit tends to mean different things to different people and different countries, etc. John, when you asked me to give a presentation and a paper on views from Oceania, I was thinking, how much space do you have in your publication? Because the first point I want to make is that we have to be really careful. I had to be really careful with generalizations here. Views from Oceania are going to differ along a number of different fronts. You obviously have the metropolitan powers have very different view of US-China relations to the Pacific Island countries proper. And then, of course, among the metropolitan powers, the Australian views are going to be different from New Zealand views of this so-called rivalry. Even within Pacific Island countries, you've got those Pacific Island countries who are aligned with the PRC, and then the four remaining who are aligned with Taiwan or the Republic of China. So there you're going to get different views from those two sides. Even among the Pacific Island countries, you're going to have those countries that are, countries in free association with the United States are going to have different views from the independent countries. And then, of course, you've got the countries in free association with New Zealand that make up part of the New Zealand realm, etc. And then beyond that, you've got different views from the different subregions. Melanesia is going to have different views from Micronesia. We've just seen recently with Pacific Island Forum, the Micronesian countries have upped and left. And so there's going to be a lot of different views from this region, from the countries themselves, from the region, subregions, etc. Even within countries, you're going to get the government views versus political opposition. Some are loyal to Taiwan, some are loyal to China, etc. Some are more closer to the United States and so forth. And then there are, of course, the views from government versus the non-government views, civil society, media, etc., ordinary Pacific people. So there are all these different views from Oceania. I want to be very careful of making generalizations. So what I want to do is just basically give some sort of general contours of what these views might be. And that's all I'm trying to do here. As a good academic, you warn people about generalizations and then you go ahead and make them. So from a New Zealand, Australia perspective, I think that the best place to start is to look at how these different actors view the region before we look at how they view United States-China relations. And so from metropolitan versus the Pacific Island countries division, what I'd like to say is that Australia and New Zealand tends to view the region through a strategic and security lens. And this has been the case for as far back as you can remember, as one can remember. You can go back to when New Zealand looked at the Pacific and wanted a greater United Kingdom presence in the Pacific. New Zealand wanted the British to play a bigger role in the Pacific. You can skip down to the Canberra Pact. When Australia and New Zealand formed this pact, that was because they were concerned at how the three big powers, China, the UK, and the United States, were going to divvy up the Japanese territories. And so if you were to read the provisions of the pact, there are specific provisions about how New Zealand and Australia assert their control over the Southwest Pacific. They were worried about how Chiang Kai-shek and Roosevelt and Churchill were going to divvy up this region. Again, for strategic purposes, they were looking at the region through a strategic lens. You can also see this with the ANZUS Treaty, again, looking at it through a strategic/security lens. If you were to look at regionalism in the Pacific, it was, again, from an Australia-New Zealand perspective, viewed through a strategic security lens. You just have to look at the two biggest, most prominent regional organizations, the Pacific Community, formerly the South Pacific Commission, used to be just made up of metropolitan powers, colonial powers. And even when Pacific Island countries became independent, they didn't fully participate until the late 1990s. So again, that was through regionalism. It was a way through which Australia and New Zealand could kind of assert their strategic security imperatives and interests in this region. You could see the same with the other, or now the most prominent regional organization, the Pacific Islands Forum. It was a way for the Pacific Island countries to gain more autonomy and independence for regionalism, but it ended up being a really Australia-New Zealand show within the Pacific Island Forum. And I guess the Pacific Plan, if you're familiar with this, kind of exemplifies the control that New Zealand and Australia have asserted over the regional agenda. Skip down to the Wellington-Washington declarations, again, an indication of how Australia and New Zealand kind of view this region. These are New Zealand, United States declarations, and it's kind of brought New Zealand back into the ANZUS framework, not as a de jure ally, but as a de facto ally. But again, it's New Zealand's viewing this region, again, through this strategic security lens. You skip down to AUKUS, it's very similar, even though it's sort of more focused on Southeast Asia. You would imagine that AUKUS would have some implications for the Pacific. And recently, we've heard New Zealand talk about the potential of joining AUKUS, not along the lines of the nuclear side of things, but more in terms of sort of cybersecurity. Very interestingly, when New Zealand launched its most recent policy for the Pacific, known as the Pacific Reset, under the last government, the coalition government, the Minister of Foreign Affairs at the time, Winston Peters, framed the new policy, which for those who are watching would probably know came around the same time as Australia's Step Up, as the Americans, the Pledge, and then you had the United Kingdom's the Lift. So all these new policies sort of came around at around about the same time. But if you were to read Winston Peters' narratives that were associated with New Zealand's Pacific Reset, it's all about strategic interests. Interestingly, he put out this piece where he referenced President Roosevelt, who had talked about the Pacific Islands as these small dots on the map, but they cover a large strategic area. And I think that kind of really nicely summarizes how New Zealand, in its new policy settings for the Pacific, called the Pacific Reset, kind of views this region. And associated with what Winston Peters said in that article, he's talked about strategic anxieties, about geopolitical rivalry in this region, New Zealand's losing influence, et cetera, et cetera. So again, I make the point that when New Zealand and Australia look at this region, it's really through a strategic and security lens first and foremost. How did the Pacific Islands sort of view their own region? Well, to understand this, you have to go back a little bit into the colonial era and realize that from the 1960s onwards, predominantly 1970s, you have all these countries coming out of colonization and finally tasting freedom, independence, sovereignty. At the same time, under colonial rule, they had, suffered a lot of resource exploitation. You can look at Nauru, for example, Bougainville, etc. So a lot of these countries were coming out of this colonial era, not only tasting freedom, but also experiencing underdevelopment. And so when they look at their own region, they see it through a lens of autonomy and development. They're not looking at the region in terms of strategic interests, like the metropolitan powers. In terms of autonomy, when Pacific Island countries look at the region, even though they gained sovereignty at independence, that did not necessarily mean gaining autonomy. In fact, a lot of the agenda was very much neo-colonial. As I mentioned, in the regional frameworks, you see New Zealand, Australia, and other former colonial powers asserting their agenda in the regional agenda. You see it in Pacific regionalism, and this is why Pacific Island countries tried to take Pacific regionalism out of the hands of colonial powers, more into their hands with the formation of the Pacific Islands Forum. And interestingly, when the Pacific Islands Forum was created, there was this sort of unwritten convention that the Pacific Island countries would be the only ones that would have their person as the Secretary General for the Pacific Islands Forum. That, of course, kind of changed in 2000 when an Australian got in, Greg Irwin. But the general convention is this was really for the Pacific Islanders to kind of control the regional agenda. Again, they're looking at the region in terms of autonomy, in terms of development. Let me skip to the next slide because I'm just running a little bit out of time. When you look at the region through these different lenses, you're going to have different views of the China-US rivalry. So if I was to just make a very general comment about Australia's views, is I could pretty much summarize them as very much pro-United States. That's always been the case for Australia as far as I can remember. When New Zealand decided to pull out of ANZUS, the Australians were very critical of this, even though it didn't really affect Australia's relationship with the United States along the ANZUS agreement. I think even in 2001, they activated ANZUS as part of the War on Terror. So the ANZUS still exists between Australia and the United States, and ANZUS still exists between Australia and New Zealand. But the Australians are very critical of New Zealand having pulled out of this because of the fact that Australians have kind of seen themselves much closer to the US than the New Zealanders. Just because AUKUS has come up recently, it's very interesting that someone referred to this as the new ANZUS, because when ANZUS was originally drafted, the Australians came into it, wanting the Americans to really integrate themselves into this region. They wanted ANZUS to be sort of like a NATO. They were quickly put in their place, and ANZUS meetings were held in Hawaii and not Washington, which personally, I lived in Hawaii and I thought that was a better choice, but it was kind of like to say, no, this is not NATO. This is a downgrade from NATO. But AUKUS has been talked about as the new ANZUS. So maybe the Australians have finally got their wish that we're seeing this sort of more closer, stronger security alliance with the United States. You also see the Australian sort of pro-US view come out with this, talk of them as the deputy sheriff. I know this was kind of downplayed at the time. It came out when George Bush met with John Howard around the War on Terror period. And, John Howard had visited George Bush's ranch, and he came out and George said, we've got a new deputy sheriff in the Asia Pacific. And a lot of people try to downplay it, but I actually think there was some truth to that. Because if you look at Australia's engagement with the Pacific after that, it was slightly different to what it was before. And a good case study would be the Solomon Islands conflict. Whereas prior to that meeting, the Australians had made it clear through then Minister of Defence and Foreign Affairs, Alexander Downer, that to engage in the Solomon Islands conflict would be folly in the extreme. And after the meeting on Bush's ranch, he came out and said, well, we must intervene. We have no other option. And again, it's this sort of indication of the closeness between Australia and the United States. And so the Australians have tended to view Australia in much more pro terms. And the Chinese, even though Australia is so close to China in terms of trade, generally I tend to think that they view China as a threat, ultimately as a threat. And I think when they look at the Pacific and they look at China's engagement with the Pacific, it comes out in these terms like China is engaging in debt traps in this region. And I think that, again, flows from how they have chosen to view the Pacific through a strategic security lens. Now, New Zealand doesn't go down that road as far. New Zealand has always asserted itself as an independent foreign policy maker. From the 1970s onwards, it's adopted a sort of more Pacific-oriented identity in international relations. But I think ultimately New Zealand would head down the same road as Australia, and that is to side with the United States. I would kind of categorize New Zealand's position as sort of the deputy sheriff's deputy sheriff. And if you were just to look at the major security pacts or treaties that they have between them, you can understand why New Zealand tends to kind of tag along where Australia goes. If you look at the Canberra Pact, in fact, if you look at New Zealand's defense documents, they say there are 3 founding pillars that still exist till today. One of them is the Canberra Pact, the other one is ANZUS, and the other one is the closer defense relations with Australia. Then, of course, you've got the broader alliance with the Five Eyes and UKUSA, etc. And so I would tend to say that New Zealand, even though it asserts an independent foreign policy, even though it asserts a Pacific identity, ultimately is going to go down the road of the United States, favoring the United States. And I think this was made clearly in a good piece by former Minister of Defense for New Zealand, Wayne Mapp, called the New Zealand Paradox, where he talked about how at the end of the day, it's that common history, those shared values that will determine which side a country aligns with. And for New Zealand, that's obviously going to be with the West and the United States. But what about the Pacific? And here's where things kind of get really interesting. Because they view their own region through an autonomy and development lens, they really want a neutral position on the on the American versus China rivalry. And they've always sought autonomy, not only at the regional level, but at the individual country level. For the Pacific, thanks, John. I know I've got 1 minute left. Okay. China really is a source of opportunities for them, and it's not a source of debt traps. They see China as giving them geopolitical opportunities where they can have more agency in relation to the former colonial powers, where they have more economic opportunities, especially with the BRI. The Pacific Island countries do not want to ascribe to having to choose between the two. Unfortunately, and this is the point I make in the paper, unfortunately, even though they don't want to have to choose, the way that the discussion is framed in this region ultimately puts them in a situation where they have to choose. And I think this is really brought nicely across by a comment by former Secretary General for the Pacific Islands Forum, Dame Meg Taylor, where she said, it's often difficult to engage in meaningful dialogue over relations with China without being labeled pro-China, and perhaps even as naive. And the point is, you could carry out a transaction with China that is really for development purposes, but it's always going to be skewed against you, as somehow you're going against the United States. We saw this with the Solomon Islands. Solomon Islands said, we want China to take over our debt. And suddenly this was, the narrative was, well, this is really, going against Australia's efforts to counter China. Let me just skip to the last two slides. It was really interesting when Mike Pence was supposed to meet with the Solomon Islands Prime Minister, but when the Solomon Islands switched to recognizing China, which made a lot of sense, most of their traders with China, Pence actually canceled the meeting. And Pence, somehow got the idea that the Solomon Islands could not recognize the PRC, even though the United States recognizes the PRC. And the narrative was framed, and not so much in terms of the Solomons switching from China to Taiwan, but in terms of, well, the Solomons have chosen China over the United States. And everything that China seems to be doing right now is really kind of seen in this really bad light. And I would like to finish with this last slide, where Kiribati is another country that switched to China recently, the same year as Solomon Islands. And as part of the welcoming ceremony for the Solomon Island for the Chinese ambassador, he got to an island and he walked across the back of several men lying down. And immediately, even though this was a cultural tradition in Kiribati, immediately it was talked about in geopolitical terms. So how can this is a sign of what's coming with China. They're going to be walking all over the Pacific, et cetera, et cetera. And the Australians came out and said, Australians would never do this. Of course, in 1998, there are reports the Australian High Commissioner to Kiribati did exactly the same thing. And if you were to look at Pacific Island Forum, you would see that there is this kind of culture in Pacific Island forums where they get these special treatments for visiting dignitaries. So I'd like to conclude by saying that the Pacific is in a really tough situation. Any neutral or just, any kind of transaction with China is going to be viewed through this dominating lens that's been put out there by the West, that this is going against Western interests. This is really pro-China, anti-West, even though it's really for development purposes a lot of times. So let me conclude there. I'm sorry I kind of gone over time a little bit.
No, thank you, Iati. And I see why you needed to get to those last slides, because those are powerful images, that really demonstrate your point about the lenses that we see things through. So appreciate that. And also appreciate you challenging the premise, another thing academics always do. I'm afraid now what Huong is going to say about being tasked with talking about Southeast Asia, but Huong, it's all yours.
Thank you, John, and thank you for inviting me to this great conference. It's a pleasure to be with you. So I was tasked with 10 minutes to give a picture of how Southeast Asia reacts to the Great Power Rivalry. So instead of giving 10 ASEAN countries 1 minute each, I embark on a sort of overview and generalization with the limits of the time, but with due recognition that it is certainly risking some generalization, yet I think there are important certain trends that can be recognized within this very diverse region, which is Southeast Asia. And I'm talking about Southeast Asia as 10 different countries, but also there is an implication of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, that sits at this core of regional Asia-Pacific centric architecture, or at least what they want to defend as ASEAN-centered architecture. So a lot of things that all my co-panelists have mentioned, there are some similarities that could be found also in Southeast Asia. So let me sort of summarize for you certain macro trends in the region, notwithstanding, of course, different choices within the region. Mind you that this is a region where you have very different arrangement with the US and China. For example, there are 2 treaty allies with the US, Thailand and Philippines. The rest have very different depth and strength with relations with US as well as with China. Let me focus a little bit more on US and Biden, what I have for a Biden administration, because the key focus of this conference. So in terms of summarizing the macro trends, I think there are several reactions that we can find overarching the different views within the region. One is a general anxiety about rivalry going on, and that might be too intense and might result in even a confrontation, which is very unwelcome result. There's also a lot that the rivalry is a long-term and multifaceted. John already mentioned several aspects that have been discussed during this course of this conference, but also, you know, what all those multifaceted rivalry will mean for the future of so-called Asia Central, whether there still be Asia Century, given that, first of all, the rivalry will result in trade decoupling, which also can challenge the growth, the economic growth of the region, but also mindful of the post-pandemic effect that really challenges the economies across the region, and particularly in Southeast Asia, where they will need to overcome not only the COVID induced stagnation, but also the fallout from potential decoupling of the trade systems. And then there is a final, in terms of this reaction, is that all countries more or less feel the pressure of taking sides. And there is this imposed pressure, and whether it's real and to what degree, it's a different discussion, but there is this anxiety that the US-China rivalry may result in bifurcation and leaving limited room for each country in the region to have positive relationship with both powers, because they do want to have positive relations with both powers. Now, those are some key overarching reactions from the region. What are the strategies that the Southeast Asian has taken so far? There's a range of strategies, and I would risk simplification, but it is, I think, the case that not all countries have ready strategy in place. I think a lot are making it up while as we go, because the nature of great power competition is also evolving. The US is talking about, you know, strict great power competition. Now it's talking about strategic rivalry. There's also a lot of things that the US and China have to figure out themselves in what particular areas they are competing and in what they can cooperate. So the region also, you know, react as they go, as the bilateral relations between the US and China evolve. But I think in general, there are certain preferences, regardless of the arrangements that have been in place for many years, or the size of the defense and economy and capacity of each country in Southeast Asia. And those are, none of Southeast Asian, regardless of size and capacity, want to be beholden to any great power. And they want to sustain as much as possible the ability to hedge it to the degree, you know, preferred individually, not only by country, but also by individual leaders, as we see from, for example of Philippines, where, you know, individual personality of the leader is very, has a huge decisive factor on the country's orientation. Another one is a hope that both China and the US are involved and engaged in the region in positive terms, right? For example, having both having economic role, and they are both actively diplomatically participating and supportive of ASEAN-centric architecture. This week we have ASEAN summits and East Asia summits and all kinds of summits. And the US, President Biden is attending after a long break of US presidents under Trump. There was effectively none. I mean, he attended in 2017, but it was a short and kind of cut short participation. And this kind of, you know, actively being involved in the region, diplomatic is very important. US is lacking a lot of key diplomatic envoys in the region, sitting there, quite a number of ambassadorial posts staying empty. Very important, and it's been empty for a while, and it's been empty for a while. It's very hard to exert your diplomatic and soft power influence if you're not there. So that's a key. And also, you know, if US is not participating in those key architectural multilateral arrangement, it will be seen as an outsider, right? It's not something that the US particularly would want to come up out as. And the third, the third component of this summary I have is that most countries in Southeast Asia are either indifferent, oblivious, or even not very supportive of Biden's democratic agenda. And this framing of competition of democracies versus autocracies and Biden's ideas of democracy, summit of democracy, is not particularly popular in Southeast Asia, and framing the ideology as a key component of competition, I'm afraid, is not going to yield much support in Southeast Asian countries that have their own very characteristic issues with political liberalization and the state and health of their of some democracies within, but also democratic retreat in general, and some underlying long-term authoritarian tendencies. So this won't fly too high, in my opinion. I think all Southeast Asian countries are pragmatic and interest-oriented rather than value-oriented. So, putting too much emphasis on values and ideology is not particularly going to yield immediate result, in my opinion. And I think to different degrees, the countries in Southeast Asia would also see that some aspects of great power competition may yield potential opportunities as well. I think some to different levels that are benefit from a controlled competition. A good, competition is good as long as it's controlled and it's not too intense and not too overskill into confrontation. So, for example, providing all kinds of public goods, competition about soft power, infrastructure investment, public diplomacy thing, and vaccines that both sides have provided, and other opportunities that Southeast Asian countries might benefit from. So actually, to a degree, different degree, competition might be good as well. So those are major trends. I think I would want to spend a few minutes to speak about, how did we get here and what's next for Biden. We got here because, the Biden administration inherited a number of results that were yielded by Trump administration, right? I've listed some already as a result of that. For example, not very much supportive of the rhetoric, and there is no economic agenda for the region, which is very pragmatic. And so on and so forth. And then the competition is going to be continued by Biden administration, right? In a little bit more elegant way than Trump administration had practiced. But I think overall the region has come to realize over the past 10 months that the competition is not going away. And a lot of America's strategy in the region and Indo-Pacific is going to be actually more similar to that of Trump than dissimilar. I think in the beginning, at the end of Trump administration, overall, of course, with exceptions, notably Vietnam, for example, but overall, I think there was a huge expectation from the region that that Biden administration will bring back more dialogue, diplomacy, multilateralism, and kind of more predictable conduct, and of course more active in providing to Southeast Asia. I think it is becoming, the sticking points during Trump administration are still sticking point now. For example, diplomacy, lack of sufficient level of diplomacy. Indonesia, for example, complains that there was no official visit of high level or higher level from Trump administration to Indonesia over the past 4 years, and hasn't been since Biden took office either. So there's a lot of reassurance to be done over there. And similarly, since Trump withdrew from Trans-Pacific Partnership, there is no economic agenda and this is what Southeast Asia is interested in. So I think, not to take over too much time, I do want to emphasize that this is a region that is interested in economic growth, relative stability, so that growth can be achieved, especially now even more important in post-COVID world, and is less interested in militaristic or defense-heavy policies that Biden administration or the current rhetoric of the competition tend to take direction of. For example, talking more and more about the contingency of war in the Taiwan Strait, for example. This is not particularly something that Southeast Asia is interested in. It is deeply worried about turning the region into an arena of confrontation, and Southeast Asia considered itself the primary arena of that of this great power competition should the confrontation happen. What's next for Biden administration? I think first of all, first things first, right? Diplomacy is the key. I think a lot of reassurance is to be done. Key appointment of ambassadors seats need to be appointed. You can't talk about how ASEAN and Southeast Asia is a central or core to Indo-Pacific if half of the ambassadors are not there and haven't been there for years, right? It's just not convincing. Can't talk about the Indo-Pacific strategy without a key economic pillar. Once again, I think it's a broken record. We've all said that, but it's still not there. I think at the East Asia Summit last night, President Biden said that the administration will work towards an economic framework, but it is long overdue in my view already. And it's already almost 1 year into his office. How much longer do we need to wait? And I think it's gotta be careful with this rhetoric. On one hand, Democratic president has a pressure on him domestically to talk about democratic agenda, and clearly this is important for him as well as for Americans. But it's got to be careful in terms of sensitivities in the region, because for example, Myanmar coup is unfolding in the region. Can't talk about promoting democracy where really it is not working in the region, and there's not really much support for the civil society fight to save their democracy either, other than few reassurance at the meetings. And I think it will be a sticking point if the administration keep pitching, democracies versus autocracies, because if you look at the global map and the global democratic health barometer, there are more declining democracies or retrenchment of democracy as a stronger trend rather than a strong democracy, including the four key ones, the quad ones that are so-called the democracy diamond, US included, all suffer from their own issues within. So I think that democratic agenda is not going to be very popular. I think I'll leave it here because I look forward to having a robust discussion on any of this aspect that I mentioned, but a lot to unpack. It's been only 10 months, but I think from the early honeymoon, so to speak, that Biden has had, I think we're slowly sliding towards the same sticking points that the Trump administration had in the region. So gotta be careful there. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Huong, and to all of you for the presentations. June, if we can squeeze one more minute out of you, is maybe you can see in the Q&A. You have questions.
Thank you very much. I am already late, but I have to answer some questions. Actually, 4 questions here on the chat room, but okay, I can categorize into 3. One is regarding Japan-Korea relationship. I think it's our common position is very clear. Korea is willing to join military cooperation with Japan on specific issues like DPRK, nuclear problem, and even like a disaster response and anti-piracy and on all that. But we're not forging a military alliance with Japan. That's clear. And in that case, so we have a similar position, and we are divided country in that sense. So Japan is more assertive about the networking kind of anti-China network. So we are a different position. And second and third questions regarding about the acquisition of, like a nuclear powered submarine. And, the one of the worrisome to me is these days is already, like arms race is beginning to accelerate in this region. But our government position is not really, I know these days we have to appeal, especially as a progressive in South Korea, we have to emphasize that how we are ready to be in defense and things like that and deterrence. And Noemyeon and Moon Jae-in as a campaign promise that we are going to acquire this nuclear powered submarine, but I don't agree with it, and US is not gonna let us. And they said this is exception to Australia, and we don't need this blue water navy. We have excellent power in the diesel power submarine, and I think for now it's enough. And finally, I'm not saying that even though I characterize plan A, plan B, of course, it's too naive if we disregard this alliance. Alliance always is fundamental platform, but I think we have to kind of out of box thinking. We don't have to be in the frame that we have to choose either one of or the other. So I want to have this collective leadership sometimes can buffer the pressure from this strategic competition. At the same time, we can fill it in, the vacancy that they leave behind the developing country. Thank you very much. I have to leave. Thank you very much. Sorry to.
Thank you so much. Great to have you. So Sheila, I'd like to hear your thoughts and follow up, and the audience could be a little confused because in the interest of time, I'm not sure they see all the questions. So just to be clear to everyone, Sheila, the question for you that June started is, how likely do you think the hostile relationship between Japan and Korea could transform to a better one as the rivalry between China and the US escalates? Very interesting question. Thoughts on that?
Thank you, John. It's a great question. It's a hard one to answer. Two or three thoughts come to mind. One is obviously the legal cases make it very difficult for the governments to get on the same page, and I'll just leave it lightly there. I'm not saying which side is right or wrong, but the governments will be hard pressed, I think, until those legal cases come to some accommodation. And I think private non-governmental actors may be well positioned to be facilitators in that. The elections, of course, Japan is in the middle of elections next spring. South Korea has elections. I don't see much movement in the short term. The Biden administration has been working really, really hard on the trilat. You saw a lot of engagement. It wasn't in the headlines. The Quad was in the headlines, but there was an awful lot of very high level national security advisor, defense secretary, secretary of state meetings on North Korea for the trilat in the first three or 4 months of the Biden administration, reflecting a desire to try to pull the trilat a little bit better and back into place. But the real question here is, what does the rivalry do to the Japan-ROK relationship, which is already challenged? And I think the danger here, and I wrote a blog about this a couple of years ago that got me in a little bit of hot water, but I'll stay in hot water. I think the question here is not whether or not Seoul and Tokyo are on the same page vis-a-vis the challenges of China, but really whether or not they bring the same kind of instruments or can bring the same kinds of diplomacy and instruments to bear. And I think you often hear government and foreign policy experts in Tokyo say, well, Seoul is not lying lined up with us on China, as if Seoul should be lined up. Well, Tokyo is not lined up with Washington on China. They don't agree. So I don't think any of us should all be expecting each other to be on the same page. The question is, where are the vulnerabilities? And I think one, obviously, was when the Russians decided to peel off a China-Russia exercise in the East China Sea to sort of poke at Dokdo or Takeshima, depending on which side of that conversation you're on. I think there's lots of vulnerabilities to exploit here. I was very happy after that to see that both countries scrambled, the ROK and the Japanese scrambled in response, but the Japanese stayed back. And then the next morning when Moscow said never happened, wasn't there, the Japanese publicly revealed the information that it was exactly as the South Koreans had said. So there's quiet signaling here, I think, between Seoul and Tokyo on these issues, these vulnerabilities. They're not going to allow exploitation. And I think that's very, very positive. But I think strategic rivalry will continue to create opportunities for pressure. And that's maybe pressure by China, it may be pressure by the China-Russia combo. But I think that's where I think Seoul and Tokyo is going to have to work a little bit to get a little bit better position to resist that pressure.
Thanks, Sheila. And that question, I believe, was from one of our students. Give credit to Hyun Ryu. And that's a very interesting case study of sort of defense against gaslighting, where, and I didn't know all the details of that. So thank you for that. I want to go next to a question from Hunter Marston from ANU, and that's for you, Huong. It took Obama 3 years to get KORUS signed, perhaps still some time for Biden to broach return to CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So he's a real optimist here. Do you see that as feasible? Also wonder if you could comment on how much Southeast Asia welcomes renewed US security focus on the region to deter China.
Yeah, the question about whether US would return to CPTPP, I think there are so many people that have made more convincing argument towards some sort of engagement, whether through CPTPP or actually even new framework. The question is whether domestically, whether Biden can take Americans with him on this journey. I think it's the narrative within the countries is so polarized in terms of any trade and globalization issues. I won't embark on predicting on that. I think it's someone for internal American politics to wait on that. But I think the region will expect some sort of economic initiative. Mind you, that in CPTPP, there are only a few of Southeast Asia, right? 4 of Southeast Asia. It's not the whole Southeast Asia. Yet, not all would benefit, even if US were to return. But, US absence from any, this conspicuous absence from any major trade arrangement or any having an economic agenda is even more, palatable, visible because of that. On your second question, I think that's a very interesting one because that really shows the diversity of views within Southeast Asia. And in my view, that diversity, or only the gap within Southeast Asia is going to only widen, not narrow. I think most of Southeast Asia would want some sort of US presence, right? There is a certain level of taking US security guarantee for granted in a way. It's been there they didn't have to think about it. Nobody would want a region completely dominated by China, right? And actively, during even Trump administration, countries such as Vietnam, Singapore, and a number of others had actively proactively, engage US so that the US stays engaged, stays interested in Southeast Asia, in South China Sea, and issues of related to security. So I think in general, countries would want US continue to play a security role, but the question to what extent? I think the worry there is US wants to either, the worry is not going there, but the worry is that US would want to go competition in terms of confrontation, or nothing at all, right? And I think the diplomats from Singapore, including the foreign minister as well as Prime Minister Lee Hsien-loong, had said that the worry is there that US either wants Southeast Asia on its side or nothing at all. And all the Southeast Asia want is that US take the region for what it is, right? Be engaged, but do not expect that military agenda, that Southeast Asia will contribute to the military agenda. And hopefully it won't go that way, but that's becoming a real worry.
Thanks, Huong. Iati, I wanted to turn to you, and you gave us such a great sketch there. I was taking notes frantically about the way that Oceania breaks down and all those lines of division. And I'd just be curious to circle back to that, because I know you have more to say. But for example, are you seeing certain models, or in the region, is there a discussion of a model, prominent models in maybe two different ways to try to play the emerging US-China rivalry? That is to say, because I think we see that in Southeast Asia and in Northeast Asia. Are there examples that are discussed there of, leaning to one side versus trying to play both sides of the fence? I'd just be curious in specifically in the Pacific Island countries context.
So we saw that with the China-Taiwan rivalry, where the two were kind of played off against each other for more financial assistance. I don't think that's going to play out the same way between China and the United States, and primarily because of the two differing approaches to the region by China and by the United States. What we've heard out of the regional organizations and the independent countries is that they really would like the United States and China to get along to help the region, to kind of cooperate together for the region's development. And I don't think they're seeing it as an either or. They don't want to have to choose, as it's sort of a different scenario to the China versus Taiwan scenario that we had previously. This one, they would like all aid donors to kind of come together, cooperate to help the region.
Thanks for that. So one question for anyone to jump in on. I'm again kind of reflecting on the full set of sessions. And while it's been very easy to use the concept of rivalry to stimulate a discussion, I think almost no one has mentioned Biden doctrine. We'll have to think about whether we drop it going forward. But that sort of intrigues me in a way. People are just ignoring it. I want to make it explicit and challenge this group. It seems like we all agree there is no Biden doctrine at this point. But if you had to take a stab at it, what do you think are maybe going to be the constitutive elements of a Biden doctrine, specifically for let's call it Asia Pacific, so as applied to this region, but you may want to frame it as a global doctrine. I kind of leave that open to you. So does anyone want to, let's see, maybe we'll start with you, Sheila.
Sure, John. I would just put it out there. I don't think there's a doctrine yet. I think it's a little too early. Remember, this administration came in January. We are in October. So I think you might want to start looking for doctrine in year 3 of the Biden administration. But here's what I think is important. And that is Biden campaigned on and came into office in terms of foreign policy by saying we want to restore American alliances. So he wanted to get away from the more transactional, more destructive approach of the Trump administration and put alliances first, so to speak. So that's an important rhetorical focus. The question is, in implementation, what does that actually mean? And I think for each ally, that's going to look different, right, in terms of their expectations. The second is, and this is a continuity from the Obama administration, shouldn't surprise anybody because the Biden administration is populated by people who are in the foreign policy positions in the Obama administration. But this is an emphasis on the Indo-Pacific. And there's no haggling over Asia-Pacific versus Indo-Pacific, but it is seriously a recalibration of America's long-term interest to the Indo-Pacific. And I think that's very important that you saw that in the early development of the meetings and the Quad and the way in which the senior leadership went out to the region. But this time it's not led by US-China. And I think that's a very big, interesting difference with the Obama folks is if we get China right, then we'll get the rest of the region right. I can't tell you how many people in the Obama administration would say something like that. Now that's not what they say. If we get our alliances right, our partnerships right, then everything our Asia policy will fall into place. So there's learning that's happened here. The one distinctive element here, I would say, and this is what we should be watching for, is the role of climate change. the appointment of John Kerry as czar, the importance that climate change as a global, initiative plays in the articulation of the Biden foreign policy, really important. Will it define doctrine going forward? Not so sure. But they have certainly put it in a place where we ought to pay attention. And then very finally, I'm sorry, I'm going on too long, but is the domestic political side of all this. There's a reason, and this is where there's continuity across, you can go back to Bush, actually, Bush and Obama and Trump and Biden. We don't like to think of them in continuity terms, but there is continuity. And that is where the American people are lining up on our foreign policy engagements. So the end of the forever wars, right? The idea that there's a foreign policy for the middle class. I mean, that's jobs, that's investment, that's Trump, but with a very different, and I think Huang used the term elegant casting. It's different, but it's the same fundamental thing. And that is that our foreign policy has to now become more aligned with the domestic political demands of voters, and whether those are Democratic voters or whether those are Republican voters. And I think it's important that this is a messaging that doesn't just go to one side or other of our partisan divide, it goes to both sides. So I think those are the elements I would highlight if we come back a year or 2 years or 3 years from now. Those are the kinds of things I would be looking for to see whether or not that developed into a doctrine.
We will come back. We'll have you back, and I'm writing this down, and so we'll see what you did.
Excellent.
Dr. Le Thu, how about your thoughts on the Biden doctrine?
Thank you. I agree with everything Sheila said. I think it's smack on. It's really a combination between, we see familiar elements from the Obama administration and Trump administration, which Sheila highlighted, and I absolutely agree. And with additional climate change, which is a relatively new standout. But I would only add to what Sheila already mentioned, that in Southeast Asia, I think there's a lot of question about that still. What is this? How does Biden stands out from a mixture of Obama and Trump, and while I highlighted the trap of going down the ideology and values in democracy versus autocracies, I think Biden is also very pragmatic in a way that in Southeast Asia, so far the administration engages more with Vietnam, which is one party state, communist party state. We've seen Secretary of Defense first visit, and then Vice President Kamala Harris. Vietnam is mentioned in interim security guideline report, and is likely to be playing more key role in Southeast Asia. Whereas, for example, Indonesia, which is a democratic country, doesn't get as much engagement and interaction. So it's not really the category of the democracies and autocracies and values. It's very pragmatic, and it's not. It's about what countries are willing to do. And I think administration has said that America is willing to help those who want to help themselves. It's very pragmatic, isn't it? And it's not even. I mean, I agree with Sheila on alliances in general. And for example, sitting in Australia, that's very visible how Australia gets a lot of attention these days, more because it's willing to do more than it used to be, is used to get attention. But for example, in Southeast Asia, again, Thailand, the treaty ally didn't get as much engagement so far. Philippines did, but it's a very fragile balance in Philippines right now, especially that we are going to have a transition of power next year with the new general election and President Duterte stepping down, and new administration will come in. So Philippines, and opinions in Philippines are very varied as well in terms of how much they want to be active in the security agendas given the South China Sea disputes. But Thailand doesn't get as much attention at all, even it is a treaty ally. So I think to sum up my point is that yes, allies, yes, and democracy, yes, but only when they are willing to help themselves and align with US view on China. I think that's what it is at the moment showing. We'll see if that continues over the next 3 years.
Great points. You're coming back as well in 3 years. We are at time, but I've got to hear, and I think with the forbearance of the audience, we all want to hear from Professor Iati, your thoughts on this. And also I want to invite thoughts on climate, because that's a lacuna in this conference. and obviously a critical issue for Oceania. So please take a couple minutes and let's hear your thoughts.
I'll make these very quick. If you want to understand, if we assume that Biden is going to follow the Obama line, then refer back to Hillary Clinton's visit to the region when she was Secretary of State. And she made it clear when she visited around 2012 that China is welcome in the region as long as it plays by the rules. And so the question is, what rules and whose rules? And I think it's pretty obvious. It's the rules that were set down by the United States, by the Western Alliance in this region. And so if Biden is to follow the Obama approach, then I would refer back to Secretary Clinton at the time. In terms of climate change, it's very interesting that the Pacific is heading down the same road that the United States had forged around 2010, 2013 period. In 2018, the Pacific came out and said the most serious existential threat to the region is climate change. Well, that language actually came first out of the Obama administration under Admiral Locklear III when he headed the Pacific Fleet out of Hawaii in around 2013. We didn't actually hear that language out of the Pacific Island countries until only a few years ago. So they're actually moving along the lines that the United States had actually forged quite a while back. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic that's happening now. Their existential security threats were really in terms of sort of poverty, corruption, etc., development. But they're heading down the road that the Obama administration kind of set around 2013 under Admiral Locklear III. So on those 2 points, those are my comments.
Thank you, Iati. There's so many more questions I have, and I know the audience wants more as well, but we do have to keep to time and let you all get back to your busy lives. So on behalf of Yonsei University and our Center on Oceania Studies, I want to thank the panelists. If we were here in person, there would be thunderous applause. I have no doubt about that. And I want to thank all of you many of you were here for all three of these sessions. And I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did and learned as much as we did. And we'll certainly be bringing you more from our center, and we'll look forward to welcoming you back. So with that, we're going to end the conference. So thank you everyone very much.
Thank you, John.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you,
guys.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.